Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dale Minyo. Joining me, Dusty Sonnenberg. You've seen Dusty wearing the headset several times on several different programs. And John Scheve, grain merchandiser at Superior Feed Ingredients. A quick update, Dusty. What did the weather do for you today?
Well, it is snowing here in the northwest corner of the state, and as I peeked out the window before we came on the air, snowing quite vigorously now. It didn't start till about 6:30 this morning, so a few hours delayed from getting here, but it has made up ground since then. So a couple inches on the ground and several more in the forecast.
John, tell everybody where you are and what's your winter been like so far.
I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and so far we've gotten quite a bit of snow for this time of year. But we had a little bit of rain back last week that kind of took some of it down. We're still sitting with about 8 to 10 inches on the ground, and that'll probably stick around until about second week, third week of March. That's usually what it happens. When it comes, and it doesn't leave. And next week, I see our highs are going to be 1, maybe 2 on one day. So that'll be exciting.
It's when you get those temperatures really easy to double. Yeah, we're twice as warm as we were yesterday, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's when you say, I think I'm happy just staying inside. I don't need to go outside.
John, in Ohio, we call that a mic drop. We're talking about our weather, and all you have to do is say Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we can't compete with that.
Not on temperature. So, yeah, our winters are unpleasant, but our summer will make up for it. So.
Sounds good. Here at my studio, when I started early morning, it hadn't started snowing at 4 o'clock. It started by 5. We were pushing an inch, and I had to run down and get an oil change, and it broke the 3 or 4 inch range. And by the time I came back, it was more fighting with slush than it was snow. And I think that's where we are. It's currently 34 degrees, but almost 20-mile-an-hour winds. So enough of the weather. Nobody wants to know about that unless it affects grain marketing. So is weather an issue at this point, John, for any parts of the country in regard to either getting stuff moved out of the bins or any place getting a weather drive in the markets?
I think that the weather, actually watching the hard red winter southern wheat belt, is probably the biggest concern. And that's probably going to have the most effect on corn. And so is that going to continually stay dry? They did have some snowstorms come through, did dump some a good amount of precipitation on. And unfortunately, as most farmers out there will tell you, wheat's a weed and it has 9 lives. And so it might be such a situation that maybe that wheat crop isn't going to be quite as bad as it was advertised. That could keep a wet blanket on corn prices. But again, the government looked at the quality of the wheat in that area, and it's really bad. I mean, it's even worse than last year, and last year didn't turn out so good. So I guess that'll be one of those, stay tuned. That's one of those things we'll be watching more in March and April.
Yeah, and as we go through, if you've got questions, go ahead and type them in on the screen, and we'll be able to get back to those questions and hopefully steer some of the things you're looking to find out. Dusty, anytime you're in, just kind of give me the nod, and we'll let you get in there with your comments. You've got some wheat up in the western part of Ohio. Dusty, how does it look?
We do. And, this was almost an ideal fall to get wheat planted. We look back the last couple of years, and it's been a little wet and challenging to get the beans off in time to get a wheat crop planted. But this year they went in, and all in all, the wheat crop looks pretty good. John, I'm curious, though, wheat is that one crop that's grown on every continent of the world. And so somebody's always planting wheat, somebody's always harvesting wheat. Weather, obviously, in different parts of the globe make an impact on that. Taking a bigger picture look than just what we see out west, because that's gained a lot of attention with the drought. And like I said, we had ideal conditions here, on the eastern Corn Belt side. What do we see bigger picture, though, with wheat out there in the markets? Is Ukraine obviously was a lot of talk with that. In the big picture of where supplies are at, what the demand you think is going to do, how does it all measure out right now?
I think you bring up some great points on wheat, but the problem with wheat is that it's a protein issue. And so your soft wheat in Ohio isn't made for bread like the Kansas City style traded wheat out in west of the Missouri River, specifically Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, parts of Nebraska. That wheat's going to be made for bread. Yours is made for crackers and cake. And it's a very good substitute for corn because it's a cheap feed. It can go down into the chicken and poultry in North Carolina, Alabama markets down there. That's keeping a blanket on corn prices in your area. Specifically, your basis isn't rallying because the corn isn't getting shipped out as much as we'd like to see it out of Ohio. And so because of that, more wheat coming later on is going to be a problem. If you actually check wheat prices out and compare all the futures, I know most of your farmers in your area are going to be watching the Chicago price, and it's $1 less than the Kansas City price. And it's hard to relate those two because it is truly a protein issue and how that's used in the feed. So the real question becomes is, does the feed in the West, or does the hard red get fed into the ration even though it's really tight? Because if it doesn't get fed, they're going to have to pull corn from somewhere, because Nebraska and Kansas are sitting on 30% less corn in the bins than normal. And so if they don't have that corn for later in the year, and let's say that wheat in the southern wheat belt of Oklahoma, Texas is not a good crop and can't replace corn in the ration, corn's going to have to be shipped from Illinois, Indiana, and even to an extent Ohio all the way west. That could eventually pull the basis higher. So that's why the basis isn't high now. That's what could cause the basis to go higher later.
John, Dale, that's interesting.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting. Typically, we probably in Ohio think of wheat as wheat, but John raises a good point. In the markets, our wheat and the wheat out west are almost two separate commodities when it comes to that.
Exactly. And so then that's also what we have to look at around the world is, what does everyone grow and what is their specific specialty? Canada grows spring wheat. That's a very high protein wheat that is used for your bagels and your pizza dough. And so what is Russia raising? And Russia kind of raises a little bit of everything as well. And they raised a significant amount and they can export that. And they aren't necessarily under sanctions on wheat, so that can still be traded, and they had a very big crop, so that's also keeping a blanket on needs around the world because they produced a lot. Australia had a fantastically large crop, although they had a lot of rain, and so their quality was dropped off. That's one issue where you can take a good hard red wheat, and if it gets rained on and isn't looking good, then it can suddenly become a feed wheat, which then competes with the Chicago style wheat. And you can then go into the corn feed rations, and suddenly that's why prices don't have to do what everyone thinks they have to do.
John, when you looked back to your newsletter, you commented on USDA's report, and one of the things that I like about the January numbers is the first time we actually get any wheat actual acres numbers versus estimates. Anything in those wheat numbers that we should get concerned about as we move to look at potential acres for next year for corn and beans?
A lot of people have been trying to say that could mean that's going to make tight corn and beans. But what I don't think people are taking into consideration is cotton prices are pretty low. We had a record production in cotton. I think you're going to see some acres drop there, at least 1 million, probably 2. And then sunflowers, they produced nearly 40% more sunflowers last year in South Dakota and North Dakota and the other areas that they grow that than they normally do. So I think we can lose a little bit there. Oats was planted a lot because it was worth so much the year before. Now there's an abundance of oats. I think you see a few acres drop there. And spring wheat in general, comparatively speaking to corn, I don't know that there's going to be a huge rush to go out and plant more spring wheat. I think it might stay steady. And so if you can maybe lose 1 million acres between those three and maybe 2 million acres on cotton, you're looking at 4 million acres. That makes up the difference of the additional wheat that was planted. I still think that corn and beans are going to hit somewhere right around that 180 million acres combined between the two of them.
Any of those acres potential loss because it may have got put in the ground as a cover crop and may go to corn and beans anyway?
Absolutely. And I think that's why everyone's going to watch that weather in the spring and see which way they're going to go. I think there's probably no doubt there's going to be a lot of double crop where you can go anywhere south of I-70. I think everyone who plants wheat, it doesn't matter if you're in Ohio or if you're in Kansas, if you can double crop that and put beans behind it, you're going to do that south of I-70.
John, jump us into your newsletter. Let's talk corn first. What are your thoughts in regard to where we are and how do we get, if we haven't sold, how do we take advantage of where we are still?
Well, I think if we pop up the stocks to use ratio chart here and we look at the last 15 years since the ethanol production has been in place, anytime we get below 10% stocks to use ratio, that is a very tight scenario. And when we look back, there's been about 7 years in which we've been below 10%. with the exception of 2013, in all of those years in the spring following the harvest beforehand, we have exceeded 740 on the futures at some point between February and May. And so is this a situation much like 2013? It's going to be hard to determine that, because coming out of 2012, our exports dropped to 700 or just under 800 million bushels, compared to the USDA still has us forecasted to do somewhere just under 2 billion. So it's substantially different situation than we were seeing coming out of 2012 and 2013. So if that's an indication, if we've seen 5 out of 6 years so far that we've seen it go back up to 740, I guess that's an indication, which we also know there is no way that we can use past performance to guesstimate, but it certainly says, look at some chances here. And this is one of those things where, hey, I got to make sure I put out the disclaimer that, this is not trading advice here. This is just simply an analysis of the market. I don't want anyone here to get mad at me later on and say, hey, you told me it was going to go up. I said it could. I did not promise you anything. So if you are trading based upon this information, you could lose all your money.
Well, John, as you take a look at wheat, then where does wheat need to be to play its part in the market? Is the new carbon and the latest developments in cover crops, is that encouraging some people to maybe get back into wheat from a soil health standpoint? Or is it really just dollars and cents at this point, and it looked good for a while, but maybe not so much as they move forward?
That's a great question. I raised wheat last year for a fundamental reason. I was going to put sunflowers behind some ground out west to try and improve the ground. I don't have any intentions of doing that again, and it had nothing to do with the financial prices on corn and wheat. Because we took corn out of production for 1 year, so I guess it did take a little bit in, but we looked at what we could make, and it was pretty much the same, but we thought maybe we could help it out. I think that's a farm practicing issue that is difficult to estimate from a marketing standpoint. I never really know how farmers are going to do. I talk to some farmers and they are pro doing all of those kinds of things. And then I talk to other farmers and they're like, there's no way you're going to get me to do all of that. So I think that's a big opinion, much like the markets. Everyone has an opinion on which way it's going to go and how they're going to do it. So yeah, I guess it's theoretically a good idea.
John, we've got a question from one of our viewers dealing with sunflowers, and you mentioned you had them, and earlier you mentioned how much sunflowers were up last year in the plantings. His question is, taking a look at those acres, do you think that, or how many acres rather, do you think could go to corn, beans, or spring wheat coming out of sunflower acres from last year, if you got a rough number?
Well, now the person asking that question is a sunflower trader at heart there, and so he's got a much better command on those specific commodities. So I feel like I'm getting trapped into answering it here. I still feel, though, that if we look at the Dakotas, I think that sunflowers, oats, and spring wheat combined will lose about 1 million acres by the June report. I'm not necessarily sure it'll be showing up in the March report, but I do think by June, I don't think that I think those commodities will all lose some acres.
Fair answer.
So as you look to the corn particularly, if you've got it in the bin, what kind of things do we need to look at as potential triggers? Is there a percent market move or a certain number of cents that we get back to that we haven't seen in several weeks or months that we ought to let a percentage go? How do we go about doing the right thing as we move forward?
If I could answer that perfectly, I would have a lot of money in the bank and I'd be thrilled. I will say that my position, I am not sold very far long on corn. And so I am obviously going to be tilted towards a bullish stance. And I still think that comes. But I'm looking at the fact that bean harvest starts in Brazil. Basically, it has started, but the bulk of bean harvest starts in about another week or so. They have a monster crop coming and they don't have enough room for it. They're going to have to put that somewhere, and the best place is to put it on a boat and get it over to China as soon as possible. So from that aspect, I'm looking for Brazil has no more corn to ship. Argentina has drought. They aren't even going to have corn for quite a while because they're just considering planting another round down there. So we're looking at least 3-4 months here where we are the only game in town with the exception of Ukraine, and Ukraine is limited in how much they can ship by how many boats are loaded every day. So I would say that we are the only game in town, and that gives us an opportunity to start exporting sooner than later. How much does China want to buy? How much does the rest of the world want to buy? It seems like most of them are going and burning through their stocks right now and contemplating putting wheat in that ration. But in general, I like the upside in corn. And again, I'm looking back at the stocks to use ratio and saying, well, if 5 out of 6 times we've cleared 740 with this tight of stocks to use, doesn't that kind of tell me that maybe I should be waiting? Should I be waiting for 740? I don't know that I will wait completely for 740 on everything, but it definitely tells me that I certainly like some of the opportunities at the upside.
John, curious, you mentioned the drought that's in Argentina and how they're struggling. And up until the moisture just recently, that's been our western states as well, as extremely dry. We've gotten moisture, but I doubt we've really recharged that subsoil moisture. Again, as you're looking into your crystal ball and we go forward, what concern would you have about a potential return to that drought for the rest of the year, and maybe what that could mean going forward? You know, there's all sorts of hype out there, the 89-year cycle, which technically wouldn't come around for about another 2 years. But, you know, we had sort of that back in 2012. So thoughts you have on that?
I mean, there's always a reason that we can have the next worst drought we've ever seen. If we look back for the last 50 years that the USDA has kept track of our yields and all of our stocks and everything, it's basically a 66% chance that we're going to raise normal or above normal yields. That still leaves us with a 33% chance of failure, and some of those failures can be very big. So that in of itself says, how do you bet against something where you've only got 33% chance? When it hits, it's going to be big, and when it doesn't hit, it's going to be a disappointment. So at the moment, I'm sitting on the sidelines saying, it could go either way yet. I don't really have a good feeling either way. La Nina is constantly supposed to have been disappearing. It's been later than it was supposed to be. Does it keep going? Does it return to La Nina? Do we really go into El Nino? I mean, when we look at the chances and when they run all of the modeling, it all suggests it's going higher, but there are a couple of those models that do say, well, we could return to La Nina for a fourth unprecedented fourth year. I'm not going to say that I believe in any one direction. I'm just saying I'm open to any possibility right now.
For the growers you work with, has that threat of continued drought played into any of their cropping decisions, or not so much?
Pretty much no. I would say the vast majority don't change their rotation. And that's where it gets so confusing, because we'll hear people saying, well, their acres are going to switch. It doesn't take too many people to change a few acres to suddenly get the USDA numbers in an area where we can have drastic movements. But by and large, when I talk to almost every farmer, and when I talk to seed dealers across the country, I'm always amazed. They can't see a change. It truly seems that about the only people who can see changes are usually the very head of any of the seed companies, where they get polls from across the country. But if I just talk to a random seed salesman, they're like, I can't tell any difference from this year versus last year. And so it's always interesting. It doesn't take very many. And then in some cases, a lot of seed people will tell me, well, they've bought for both directions and they don't know what they're going to do, and they're going to return that seed later that they don't use. So I think that's why it's so difficult to figure it out until it's been planted.
John, I pulled up the Chicago Board of Trade for December 23 corn, and it would be about 70, almost 80 cents lower than March. Do you have any suggestions as we approach a $5.90, almost $6 December new crop corn figure? Is there a percent we should have marketed? How do we go about making sure that we're on the right track going into this season and not missing a current potential? Or is there so much upside potential to get rid of the old stocks we need to wait and see?
That's difficult to answer because it
That's
does.
why I've been working on it for days.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And so it's hard for me to answer it straight out because, and it's going to seem like I'm not answering it because I'm probably trying not to, but that is because it depends what your overall plan is between the two crops. I don't think that old crop relates to new crop at this time. I think you could see, you said that was an 80-cent spread between the March and the December. We've seen that go beyond $1 before. So there is the chance that old crop can continue to go up and new crop doesn't have to move. To me, it feels like new crop is waiting to see how many acres are there. And I would have said that when new crop beans were up around 14, it was suggesting that more bean acres should have been going in the ground. There were a lot of people trying to say that it made more money to plant corn over beans, but they were looking specifically at Iowa and Illinois and to some extent Indiana, which of course those places always are going to say that. It's the fringes, and it's truly Nebraska, Ohio, it's Kansas, it's North Dakota, South Dakota. Those are the areas that are going to see the changes in the acres. It isn't going to be Iowa and Illinois. And so typically what I see in Ohio is you're looking for any reason to put beans in the ground. And the yield versus the corn yield versus the bean yield usually suggests in Ohio, we're going to see a push towards beans. And with the recent drop and pullback here down into the lower 13s would suggest that corn has a little bit, has gained back an advantage in Ohio, or at least isn't under the threat of losing the acres that it should. So did farmers sell? Did farmers buy fertilizer? And there's the other question is fertilizer prices continue to drop, how will that play into effect? Will that make more corn, or will that still lead people to wanting to go to beans? And long term, though, beans are so good for everything because of the biofuel mandate. And as long as we continue to make biofuel and push for that, that is going to continually be a very, very good thing for the bean market. And if it's a good thing for the bean market, it is going to encourage corn prices to go higher.
John, can you comment a little bit more on that? I mean, it's been a few years since I actually tried to break out the difference between exports and ethanol production. When did we start to produce more ethanol in country, even though some of the ethanol might be exported, than the actual amount of bushels that we're exporting? Do they take different roles now as we watch that?
1/3 of the corn is used in the ethanol market. And so whether that's exported or whether that's used domestically, I haven't looked at it and broken it down. I just care about total usage. And to me, it feels like that the biofuel on the soy side is going to be almost doing exactly what we saw corn do, which is we're going to move to a significant portion of the crop. I mean, there's been reports that we need an extra 30 million acres to make up for this incredible increase in biofuels. But I think what will actually really happen is that we're going to see that we will no longer export beans, and that we will let South America basically take over all exports on beans. We will become the de facto meal production in the world, and probably force Argentina into a totally different situation if we continue to process this. And if we're not exporting beans, that picks up quite a few acres for us, almost 10 million acres, I think. And then additionally, what will probably happen is we will continue to export less corn because our corn prices will be so high. And we will take care of our traditional partners, Mexico, unless they change something on that whole non-GMO issue. But that's a long-term issue and something I'm not actually going to be concerned about at this time, because that's a government show that will have to go back and forth between the two. But in general, we may not be exporting a ton of corn. So all the acres are going to come from Brazil. And they did say that they can keep expanding at nearly 4 or 5% a year in production. They've got 60 million acres down there that are not Amazon rainforest, but more savanna type of conditions. They're going to be the ones who make up for the amount of production we're having here, going towards bio and ethanol. And even if we do have electric vehicles come into more and more into driving, and that means a little bit less ethanol, if we have the biofuel under soy, we're going to just be shifting corn acres over to beans.
Do we have the ability to use the extra meal that we're going to produce if we're producing for the oil now?
I think that meal will have to be exported. And I think what we will do is replace Argentina as the meal exporter of choice, because everyone's going to want to come and get our meal. Argentina may have to change how they do things and switch it from being a meal exporter to a bean exporter.
John, you mentioned the relatively high price that corn would probably have, and that would be an impediment maybe to some exports moving forward. Factoring into that, then the value of the U.S. dollar, how do you see that playing out? If the dollar weakens, could that change that scenario?
Absolutely. Dollar weakens, that only is good for exports for us. And so the question just becomes, how's it going to affect it? But just because the dollar is going down, is it going down compared to the Brazilian real, or is it going down to the rest of the world currencies? It only matters what's happening with the real, because that's our only competitor in the bean world. A little bit for wheat compared to what it's doing against the Australian currency, and I guess against the Russian ruble as well. But those are two separate issues right there.
Dale asked, go ahead. I was going to say, Dale asked about soybean crush and some of the oils and the meal. Regionally, we also see some additional premiums to soybean farmers for those, premium oils. In Ohio, we see a large push for the Plenish hyoleics and crush plants that are being built. How much of a swing is that on the radar when it comes to maybe more local decisions of the corn over bean scenario? When we look at the economics, but now all of a sudden in certain regions, we do have that outlier of an additional premium that maybe doesn't apply everywhere.
It will be a very, very regionalized type of issue. It won't affect overall markets. It probably won't even really affect overall markets for even Ohio if you've got one or two elevators that are taking a bunch of Plenish or non-GMO or whatever they're trying to do. That is exceptionally regionalized. We see that out in the West with white corn versus yellow corn, and it truly, it only affects that particular commodity and only that locally. And so that's specialty product. I mean, at that point, you're not really raising corn. You are, or beans, but you're not, or corn, whichever one you're in. You're raising it, but you're not raising. It's just a pricing mechanism off of the futures market. It's really a question of what is that premium, and is it worth it to take the chance for all of the hoops that you have to jump through to raise that other crop.
John, as you look to things, we're talking corn and beans because that's what a lot of guys have to raise, and that's what they're set up for. But talk about are there other opportunities in different regions of the country with young people getting into farming operation? I was amazed the number of hemp acres that USDA has reported that people now have the chance to be surveyed on. Other diversities that you see around the country. Are there some ways that you've seen people successfully add to their grain setups so that they can diversify the farm and maybe bring a son or daughter into the operation?
There's always an opportunity. You just have to be looking for what it is and where you are. I mean, if you're close enough to a big city, raising pumpkins and having a pumpkin patch can be an absolute gold mine, but that's also very regionalized, and there can't be more than a couple of you next to it, or we're going to run into a real problem with pumpkins. And I was down in southern Indiana and I saw watermelon farmers down there. So, I mean, there's a little bit of everything. And sometimes I don't think we realize that you can find a specialty product. It's more, you have to hunt it out and find out what is the market looking for and what isn't the market getting. I mean, we've seen farmers who've gotten into the hay business and doing irrigated hay. Because they think that's got a better job for them. And they tell me that it's good in years where it's dry and the corn crop doesn't do well. We do better in hay. And then in the years where we do really well in our corn, our hay is not very good quality. So, I mean, you're hedging one crop for the other. Obviously, diversification is a nice thing to do, but it also creates headaches, and it isn't as easy as everyone thinks. And I know that jumping into some of those odd commodities, you run into a marketing issue. You're trapped by when people will take it. So it sounds good on paper. I will say that probably 95% of the people aren't actually going to go through with it because it's way too much work for the price. But for a select few people, it can be a very good opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's that small percent is out there. And as people look at that opportunity, they're looking for anything to take them out of that 100% category who have a basic commodity that has to be sold and now competes even more on the world market. It may be a better chance to understand your local market and develop some ends to be able to do that. And maybe some of that's going to be more fruit and vegetable production and grow local. So we talk about the big picture, but we're all in. But at the same time, if there's a way to help balance things out, then it's always interesting to look at those. But again, there is no silver bullet on that one as well. So
no, if it was possible, everyone would quickly jump to whatever that is. There is a ton of risk in all of those other products, and what I think most people don't look at is the fact that the corn and soybeans, while it is easy, we have the ability to lay off a tremendous amount of risk in our production, whether that's through crop insurance, whether that's using options, whether that's using futures or what have you. You can lay off a tremendous amount of risk, but I don't think that most producers get into doing the amount of laying off of risk that they should. And most of the time that's because people feel that they don't want to give up the shot at the home run to eliminate the strikeout. And so they would rather have that home run always on the table. But when you have the home run on the table, you risk a strikeout. So that isn't a lot of people's human nature to think that way. But as a risk manager, that's kind of how I view it all the time, which isn't a lot of fun to always think about all the downside.
John, we often talk about livestock being the number one customer of our cash grain commodities. And when we look at what's gone on in the livestock industry this past year, high path avian influenza wiping out millions of birds and several flocks across the country. We've seen a lot of beef cattle go to market early because of the drought out west and feed availability and things. Is there enough change in the livestock industry to move the meter where we see for grain demand, or because of the funds, because of the international markets, is it just sort of a blip but not a major factor?
That one is going to come down to very much an opinion and probably someone who's going to speak their position, which I am going to speak my position then right now, which is I don't think it is a big enough deal this year. I don't think there is enough chickens lost into the avian flu. And we're going to get a better picture on January 31st when we figure out how many cattle are still on feed. But my assumption is that isn't quite as significant as what we think has been lost towards feed. And I think that the feed category has a lot of opportunity to offset any more problems we have with exports or ethanol going forward.
Fair enough.
Do you want to spend some time on what it would take to get producers to feel comfortable locking in next year's corn, this fall's corn and this fall's beans? Is there a magic number? Is there a history lesson that we ought to learn that, when you get this one rally, these are some things you ought to consider as you market a percent of your upcoming crop?
Again, it comes down to how your overall strategy is working to just say that, because there's been a lot of people in the markets lately who've been coming out and saying, oh, you got to protect because this thing can only go down, and they look for it to only tank. I understand that concern, and I do realize that that's possible. I think there are some random upside situations here. The war in Ukraine is going to leave a situation where there's a lot of people that I've been reading that do not believe that the corn acres are going to come to Ukraine this year. They're going to plant a lot of sunflowers instead because it just requires so much less inputs. It requires less work in the fields. And so because of that, we could be looking at a lot less corn, which could mean that by summertime, it doesn't matter quite what our situation is. The world might be short on some corn. What does that do for next year? How tight is the bean situation as we move into 2024 with all of the biofuel? And here, I've got some of my exports for just this year. What I've been looking at is I don't really see any situation here where corn is going to find any carryout that's going to be overly carried away unless we do not change the feed value and the feed value stays the same and we actually lose ethanol and we lose exports, which is shown in one of those columns there where we get up to almost a 1.4 carryout. 1.4 carryout, that's going to drive nearby like July corn sub $6. But, are we really going to go to that level? Again, I'm not so sure that we will. Our exports, they have the room to maybe drop another 100 million, and ethanol probably has the capability with the pace we're grinding right now. It could drop 100 million as well. But again, the feed area, I touched on it this week in my newsletter that milo or sorghum or whatever you like to call it, grown out in the western states, we lost over 200 million. It was close to 265 million bushels from what should have been raised the year before because of drought. And in any given year, that might not have been a true 265, but there was surely 200 million bushels lost. Well, that's a direct competitor of feed against corn in those rations out there. And how is that going to be replaced? Odds suggest it might be wheat when it comes in May in Texas on the harvest, and maybe early June. But again, I'm still concerned about the feed category unless we see a dramatic increase in wheat to offset all of that. And so that's why I think that I don't think the carryout number is going anywhere. I don't think it gets a lot tighter. I just don't think it gets a lot easier to breathe. I think that it's going to remain tight. If anything, I'm more worried that it could get tighter, just from a sheer fact of exports could come in, but we may not see that for another 45 to 60 days.
John, the unforeseen, we never know what it's going to be, but if all of a sudden we pop in the early morning screen one day and December 23 corn is $7 and a few cents, do we market some?
Oh, okay. From that aspect, yes. I have orders in to sell before that too. So
okay,
I'm looking up into the mid sixes.
So what, I mean, you can't ever hit everything right in the future, but as we look back, we know guys that had $17 beans in the bin and somebody wanted to buy them and even wanted to truck them. And the farmer's reaction was, I don't need the money right now. And they sold them at something lower later on. And it really didn't seem to matter, but you hate to miss out on one of those things because whatever it might be. Nobody ever guessed Russia, Ukraine was going to develop about a year ago. We're not quite to the year yet, but as you look to that, and we don't know when the next other wild thing might be, is it, for some reason, all of a sudden, South America, somebody comes up with a reason that they're not going to buy South American grain, and we get a quick rally. When is a number good enough that we got to be able to market some percent? I mean, is $7 corn and $16 beans something to look at?
I think it's difficult to say that number because what gets us back to that number? What gets us to $7 new crop corn? Is it happening in July because there's drought? No, that might not be the right answer to be selling $7. And when you talk about the people who did have $17, $18 beans and rode it all the way on down, usually what the exception is, not all of them, but a lot of people who are in that situation are always in that situation. They're never going to sell under any scenario. So I don't think you can really ever convince somebody like that. But my thoughts are always, I've had farmers asking me, well, are you going to sell if it gets to 7.25 or 7.5 or $8 on the old crop? And my response is, I might sell 10% at 7.25, but I want to see why it's getting to 7.25 before I'm going to say I'm going to go sell it all. I'm going to wait to see if we go, why are we there? Is there protections that should be put in place? Again, we can put downside protection. Maybe it costs a little bit by buying options. I'm not pro buying options by any means. I don't usually do it, but I do understand the nature of it. And there are times that I've put it into my marketing plan. But what gets us to $15 beans? Is it because Brazil's having a problem? If Brazil's having a problem and that gets us to $15, I'm not necessarily a fan of selling them. I'm not against protection, but I don't think that you can just make a general statement that you should sell if we get back to a certain level, because I think you have to understand why are we at those levels? And there are times, I will say that a month ago, I did sell beans when it hits $15 right after Christmas. And we came in, that was a surprise to me, because when we went home on the 23rd, I looked at the market at $14.80 and I'm like, I don't think it's going to be up on Monday. Looking at the weather forecast, I expect it to come in down 20 cents on the 27th. And we came in and we were up 20 or 30 cents. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I was betting the other way. I think this might be an opportunity. So I sold some beans there. Well, it kept going, and it was a little bit of a disappointment. But then I look at it today and I'm like, oh, okay, well, that wasn't so bad. And I did put my first protections on for next year at 14, and it looks good today. But I'll tell you, after I made it, it didn't necessarily look so good. So sometimes it's one of those things where, what's your goal? How much do you want to make? And how greedy do you want to be? And that is a question that I don't think anyone can really answer as a whole, because I think everyone has different greed than others.
You mentioned the word. Oh, go ahead. I'll come back to mine.
I was going to say, John makes a good point, but if you are offering $16, I have some beans I will sell you today. I just wanted to put that out there for the record. So
Is that trucking?
I'll sell a little bit earlier than that.
Okay, I'll go back to my other theory then. As you sit on the outside looking in, at some point, if we look at history, is there a percent return on investment that we rarely get to? And we can't talk about a corner bean price, but if we're looking at a number that's 35% return on our investment, are there other statistics that tell us we rarely ever get to 35? Is the percent 30? Is there numbers from a return on investment side we ought to look at, totally ignoring the market price, because we know that percent rarely is ever reached? And if we can get there, we can sell confidently that this is, regardless of price, a good return for our work and effort.
I think you bring up a great point, but I think the issue is that the people who would look at those type of returns would have already sold, and the people who have no idea what their return is aren't going to know that that return is there, and they're going to be concerned about beating their neighbor and selling higher. And so from that aspect, I think that you're talking with two, you have a good idea, but that isn't how farmers are going. That's not how a lot of farmers are going to do it. I'm not going to say a majority. I'm just going to say a lot of farmers don't know their break even, don't know their return on investment, and don't have a goal and don't write it down. That is probably just an overall marketing flaw over time. But a bad marketing plan will work occasionally. The worst marketing plan in the world works occasionally. The problem is, the best marketing plan in the world only works about 70, 80% of the time. So there's going to be times that it fails. So a great marketing plan usually is it offsets with the worst marketing plan in the world.
But I'm going to come back to that in just a second. A good marketing plan that always returns a profit is a good plan.
You would think so, but you'd be amazed at how people can get upset when they turn a profit, but then they miss out because their neighbor with the bad marketing plan destroys them on the value that they get.
I fully understand. I've run into several on that beat the neighbor market mentality, because when that 100 acres down the road comes up for sale, I've got to have years of better marketing so that I have the advantage on it. And for a lot of people, I think that probably is very stressful marketing.
I think it comes back to, because I ask a lot of farmers this question: do you want to be profitable, or do you want to beat your neighbor by 20 cents? And that is a very difficult answer to get out of people, because in some years they want to be profitable. In other years, they want to beat them by 20 cents. You can't do both. You have to have a plan in place ahead of time and saying, I'm accepting this. But there are going to be times when you accept the one over the other, and it's not going to be so pretty.
It's kind of like deer hunting, it's the first week and he looks really good size, and you haven't seen anything bigger on camera. And it's like, well, do I go ahead and take the opportunity? And there's several weeks or months of season left. Do I really want to spend more time out here to see if there's something better? And then you have to make that decision and live with it. So
that is probably a fantastic example.
John, so
we are anything else?
Yeah, we are a week away from the first day of February. So in your mind, as we enter February 1st and looking ahead from that point, 30 to 60 days, what are maybe the top three things I should have on my radar, whether it deals with crop insurance, with futures markets? What should I be paying attention to first and foremost in the next 30 to 60 days?
Probably the export pace on corn. That would be the number one thing that I'd be watching. If our exports pick up, that is going to be a bullish signal for us. If they don't, that might mean more sideways trading. I think there's a little downside on old crop corn. New crop is an issue of, we're waiting to see what the acres are. We get the first look at a guess on acres from the World Economic Forum deal was that third week of February. But we saw last year where they came out with one number, and by the March report, it was drastically different, and the market reacted significantly differently.
Good.
As we looked back to the last couple of years, any producers talking about, gee, what I learned this year was when the soil's right, you got to plant no matter what the calendar looks like? Did we finally decide that maybe March really is too early? I mean, we did have a guy a few years ago that actually, it did make a crop, not a great one, but he planted the last day of winter before spring actually hit, and it came up and survived. Survived might be somewhat of an exaggeration, but he let it survive. So as you look to that, when do you think, I mean, if Mother Nature turns really good, is that good or bad for corn? Is it good or bad for beans? If it's delayed, which one wins?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that I would change any practices based upon 1 year. That's kind of like going back to bad marketing. Bad marketing works once in a while, but I would stick with what works for you. And if that's always planting in December, fine, be it. I watched that guy too online, and I never heard how he did. But if you got to get a couple of years under your belt trying some of that stuff to see if it really works. As far as the marketing side of it, yeah, I mean, if we do get delays, that's a problem. If it's dry and you can go, I mean, it's a different weather. It's funny to watch how Ohio farmers are usually some of the last farmers that get planted on the corn that I see in the country. It's amazing how farmers in Fargo will be done before the farmers in Columbus. And we usually just figure we're going on the day that our insurance starts, and that's going to be April 10th or 11th, somewhere in there. That's just pretty much a given unless it's raining that day. We're going to go and get it in as fast as we can and be putting the beans in within a week after that. But that isn't the situation you're going to see in Ohio. And what's always intrigued me is Ohio, most farmers have, if they're reasonably decent size of 1,000 acres, most of them have 2 planters, 2 tractors, and they're running at the same time. That's just becoming kind of common out west, where people will have 2 planters set up for it. Usually it's, go plant corn, and then I'm going to come in and plant beans right behind it. So it's a function, just you have a much different spring than we do in the West. And so it's always fun and interesting to watch how that works. But yes, a delay in corn obviously puts some pressure on beans, but I don't think that happens until after Memorial Day.
I've heard, John, in Fargo, you got to plant the corn before the frost goes out, because if you wait for the frost to go out, you'll never get it planted in time. And in Ohio, we do just the opposite. We wait till the frost is gone, till the ground is fit. And you're right, it's pushing June before we get the crop in. Just sort of an interesting dynamic there. And
then it totally depends what your August weather is like on that June planted corn as to whether or not you're going to be happy with those yields or not. So your weather is very much different from a lot of the corn belt. And so, in that regard, things are done differently in the East.
Our wheat acres are up in Ohio and in some other parts of the country. Your thoughts on double crop beans?
Absolutely. If you can do it, try it. And, I'd be pushing it as far north as I possibly can to see if you can get it done. I think it just depends what day you get that out. I was talking to some producers out west who tried double cropping, and they told me, yeah, we had a frost come in the area, and it did hurt yield somewhat on their double crop. But, they were significantly north of I-70, just south of the I-80 level. And so, yeah, I mean, the frost was a little bit earlier than it should have been. I think they were expecting to get at least another week, and had they gotten another week, I think it would have really helped their yields out. Again, I think you take that chance, but it depends, what risk you're willing to take. But I would always try double cropping if I can.
And we've also seen in Ohio, Dale, that change now in crop insurance, where we can have crop insurance on double crop beans in several counties we didn't have the opportunity on, and the planting dates changed also.
And that will definitely then encourage more planting of it.
Any final comments, John? Anything we've missed? Any last calls for your newsletter?
If you want to read what I'm putting out, send me an email and I'll add you to the list. Otherwise, you guys do a pretty good job of running it every Wednesday after I put it on. So it's usually on your site all the time. So I appreciate you guys doing that too.
So tell us, when we got the Monday report that you file on Friday, how many times do you do that a year driving down the road in your car or truck?
How did you say the question again?
Your commentary you send us on Friday on the markets that we use on the Monday morning early broadcast. How many times do you actually do that in your vehicle going somewhere?
I tend to do it from wherever I am, but I try not to be in the car when I'm doing that. I usually am stuck somewhere, trying to find a hiding place so my kids aren't yelling in the background, because I figure you don't want to hear them fighting. I have to listen to them. You don't want to do that. But yeah, no, I try to do it on Friday afternoon, and it's always a surprise then how did it work Monday morning, and did I have a good prediction for the weekend?
Yeah. It's always fun to get that and see what's going on. And it's like, okay, I hadn't thought about that aspect. Now all week I got to be thinking about, well, John said this, and am I seeing any of that in the markets and so on? So always fun to have a little bait out there to see what I need to be looking for. We appreciate all the update and information, your time and effort at putting all this together. And again, if you want more information, you can always get a hold of John at his website. If you got individual questions you haven't asked, and you want to direct it to that, John's available for that as well. Dusty, any closing comments?
I think it was a pretty good session, John. Appreciate, as always, all your good information, a lot of good food for thought.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Yep. I'm up to 22/100 of an inch of rain. So it got a good bit since we started. It's now almost 36.7 degrees. So we're going to start melting here in central Ohio. So we're going to send it all down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, and they can use it to float any kind of boat that they like.
Yeah, that will be nice. We appreciate that. Thank you very much for doing that.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Dale Menyo, along with Dusty Sonnenberg, and our guest today, John Scheve, grain merchandiser at Superior Feed Ingredients. Thanks for joining us.